And we welcome you to the Vince McMahon Netflix documentary series, episode number 5. This is Wrestling Versage and Zach McGibbon. Zach, how are you?
Doing pretty good, Lee. Yeah, looking forward to chatting about this. We're getting close to the end here of our recap of the Netflix documentary on Vince McMahon. So let's get on going here.
So the Netflix number 5. I have to admit, when I watched this one, Zach, it fired me up family business even more than some of the other episodes have, which I can't even believe is true, but it kind of sets me up for what I'm hoping for the final episode is a little bit more. So instead of me starting off, I want you to kind of start off with a little bit of your take on family business, how Shane McMahon gets into the business, gets out of the business, how Stephanie was brought in, how Linda McMahon was there, some of the things that happened, and how Vince McMahon spoke about his own family being directly involved in the business from beginning to end, like nothing trumps business. That really was the way that this documentary kind of started. And I'm eager to hear your initial thoughts on this episode and some of the things that for you that really stood out.
Yeah, I think you touched on it there, and really to kind of hone in on it, specifically the relationship between Vince McMahon and Shane McMahon was what really stuck out for me in this episode. We had heard for the longest time about, the relationship between Shane and Vince and Shane's relationship with the family in general when he left the WWE back in the late 2000s before making his return in the late 2010s. So I thought the dichotomy of these two in terms of Vince McMahon, as you mentioned, and that's kind of the central theme throughout the documentary about how business trumps everything in the mind of Vince McMahon. And, Shane was a guy that wanted to have the affection from his father and wanted to get the thumbs up, the hug. But it seemed to be, whenever there were sort of ideas that Shane wanted to pitch, Vince would shut it down. And I believe, there was the thing with Paul Heyman talking about, a dinner that they had as well, and how you have to get through me if you want this business. It's a very Paul Heyman way of describing it. It's very flamboyant. It's very over the top, for lack of a better term, but it really kind of drives home the point in terms of, the relationship between Shane and Vince and how it's kind of evolved and at some points devolved over the years. To me, that was my biggest takeaway from this episode, was that relationship and how they honed in on it. In fact, I thought this was one of the stronger parts of the documentary. So there was some interesting stuff there when it came to that.
Yeah, so I'd like to expand on what you said because it was the same for me. And I think one of the things that really stuck out was, look, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. And do we know exactly what the relationship is between Vince McMahon and Shane McMahon? No. But it does paint a little bit more of a picture that it's not exactly as tight as maybe a lot of people would think that it is, especially with him being on camera, and a character and involved in some of the dealings. And when he went away, did people really know why he went away? I think what I took from this, Zach, for the most part, was I left this episode with the fact that I don't think they're tight.
No.
Would you agree?
I would agree with that, yes.
Okay. How many wrestlers would you say along the way, and you don't have to name an exact number, but is it a lot, some, a few, none? How many wrestlers have said over the years that they consider Vince a father figure?
Oh, quite a bit. There's been quite a few wrestlers, so all the way from like top name wrestlers, especially, but even downwards to some of the mid card. It seems like there's a lot of wrestlers that kind of look to Vince as that sort of father figure.
That makes me really sad.
Mm-hmm.
That you are not a father figure in your son's eyes, and at least that's the way it came across. I don't know that for sure. I would even go as far as to speculate that Stephanie McMahon's been involved in the business all the way through, and of course with her marriage to Triple H, Paul Levesque, and them running the business behind the scenes. I wonder what her relationship really is with her father. But there was that one scene that had them walking away talking about, that Shane just wanted at some point to take over the business and was willing to put in his time and even leave the business to come back and learn. And Vince just kept saying, like, this is my business. You didn't do this. I did this. I did this. This is my business. I make the decisions. And it's like, yeah, for sure. I get it. You think that, you bought your dad out for what? You borrowed money until you get, they documented it earlier in the show, how he borrowed a little bit of money and ended up paying his dad back. It would be nowhere near what Shane would have had to do to buy the company. And Vince, whether it was Shane or Stephanie, or he seemed to have this disconnect between everything that he accomplished. He wants to make sure that not only does the world see that he accomplished this, but his son, his daughter, it doesn't matter, family. I did this. I created this. I did this. You didn't do it. So no matter what you do to learn, no matter what you do to, put yourself in the middle of it and try and learn the business as best you can. So at one point you can take over for me. He's like, that's just not happening. He's so egotistical that he can't even do that for his family. He can't walk side by side with his family and not tell them, like, this is mine. This isn't yours. This is mine. And then every wrestler, not everyone, but you know what I mean? I would even go further than that. A ton of wrestlers would say, I would consider Vince McMahon a father figure. Massive names, mid-card names, you name it, they say it. But the disconnect between his own family and what he did to them, look, when you are responsible for your own actions at some point, where if you're Shane McMahon or Stephanie McMahon or Linda McMahon, you don't have to go on TV and watch your husband make out with Trish Stratus while you're in a coma. You don't have to do that. You chose to do that. But imagine Vince McMahon doing that, thinking that that's a good idea because it's best for business. The best thing possible for business is for me to make out with every young girl that comes along and have my wife watch on TV.
Mm-hmm.
Disgusting is not even the word for it. For me, it's beyond that.
Yeah.
And I think they referred to it in this episode about how many times, he would kind of claim that it's best for business when it was really just him playing out kind of his own world, his own fantasies and his own world, and using his wife and kids to do that is beyond anything that I don't even have a way of sort of comprehending what that you would think that that's a good idea. and that people would go along with it. So this is a really hard show for me to watch, this one, because this one cemented. Look, you can do bad things in the world. I get it. People do bad things all the time in the world. And a lot of it has to do with ego and invincibility and it doesn't make it right. And I actually feel very, very bad for, the victims of crimes, of some of the things that have happened along the way. But this guy doesn't care about anybody. It's one thing not to care about a stranger or somebody that you sort of are in business. So it's another thing to not care about your family.
Yeah.
And I can't believe I'm missing the words here, the difference between what he would do and the roles he would put his family in, and then these other wrestlers, how many of them have come along saying that he was a father figure to them. My mind is blown with that kind of stuff, that could be possible.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me too of when Jon Moxley left the WWE and did that interview with Jericho about his time in the WWE. He mentions when talking with Vince McMahon that Vince has this sort of Jedi mind trick that he would do with wrestlers. And Moxley made it a point to say, I'm not going to fall for the Jedi mind trick that Vince would play on me, because he was so committed on leaving the company at that point that, the envelope with the offer of all this money, he didn't even want to look at it because he wanted to leave that company so badly. And I think it kind of goes back to, all these wrestlers kind of falling under the Jedi mind trick of Vince McMahon, where he's able to manipulate. And because, as you mentioned, he has this wealth, this power behind him, that he feels this invincibility because of all of it. And because he's essentially a lone player, especially after the Monday Night Wars, he's a lone player in the wrestling business. So there's this thought process of, well, I got to do what this guy says, because if I don't, I'm going to lose a job. And there's nowhere else for me to go other than toiling away in the indies. So it really is, as you mentioned, like watching it and you just kind of see it on screen. And I think for some that watched during that era, they thought, oh, this was this crazy guy and this is just hilarious watching all of this. But now you kind of look at through this lens, everything that's happened since then, with all the stuff with Janelle Grant and more that's come out since then, about Vince McMahon, and you go back into this era through this documentary, you kind of look at every sort of storyline that's been done and you see it from a modern eyes, and it's easy to kind of look back, hindsight being 2020, and look at stuff, but it really does open your eyes on just what he was able to get away with so blatantly too, by the way, on screen, and was able to get past everybody. Yeah, as you mentioned, having, booking affair storylines on TV. One of the things that was kind of interesting as well, I don't know if you caught this in your watching. I don't know if you had the subtitles on for the documentary, but it was kind of noted that there was the segment. They talked a lot about Sable and the lawsuit in this episode as well.
Yep.
And there's that scene where the producer he says, what about your affair with Sable? And Vince is kind of caught off guard. He's kind of looking around. He's like, I don't know. And you hear a voice in the background. If you don't have the subtitles on, you hear somebody yell, storyline in the background. And he's like, oh, storyline. Ah, ha, ha. It's, that was the whole thing that we did. I thought that was interesting in the sense that if you look at the storylines, they actually say who the person that was that shouted out storyline. And it was Paul Heyman that shouted that out over to Vince, which I thought was interesting because it kind of goes into that inner circle that Vince McMahon had at that time, and Heyman being a part of that inner circle now. So I thought that was interesting for that standpoint, but also, just how he looks at this stuff and says, I this was all for business. And going back to Heyman as well, he mentions that Vince only has one true monogamous relationship in his life, and that's with the wrestling business. And you just hear all this stuff, and you got to think, man, there's got to be more to your life than just the business. You have family, you've got other aspirations, and we hear so much about Vince and his character in terms of how he just doesn't sleep, and he's so committed to the business that nothing else matters. And there's always been the joke that he probably has no hobbies because he's just so committed to it. So it really kind of shines a light on all of that, and you really learn a little bit more about Vince himself through this episode.
Yeah, you do. And I think for the viewer that doesn't know a ton about wrestling, you would understand that, like, he comes across, and that's the thing that bothers me the most, not just in this episode, but the whole documentary so far, is kind of still coming off as this family-owned business, that he was a victim of a lot of things growing up, and almost, they don't say it, but it comes across like it's not all his fault because of some of the things. Like, he's like this because.
Yeah.
And I just hate that. Like, it's just such an excuse. It doesn't mean that all of those things didn't happen, but there's just been so many people in the world that have had things happen to them. Everyone's had stuff happen to them, and people, they learn, they get help, they fix it, they don't let it happen to the next generation. And it's just this point where it's like, he's too much of this, to me, came across again like he was somehow a victim. And as you said, he's married to the business, and that's the only monogamous relationship. And it's like, oh, okay, I understand. He's just so committed to the business that screw everybody else. Well, that's great if it doesn't, it makes you a bad person. But if you're not married and you don't have kids and you don't actually commit crimes against people, at some point you go, okay, well, that's just not a good guy. But now it's just so beyond that. And I don't know. The whole Sable thing, I don't understand, because if you're committed to something, like if you're Sable and you're committed to something, the fact that you go back on screen and be his lover again on screen after suing him doesn't help the cause.
Yeah.
For her, or, and Brock Lesnar still being involved in the company. It's just, Zach, this one hurt me a lot, because it was, if you watch this and didn't know anything about wrestling, you would always tell someone, like, if you watch this, you go, why would I watch that person's product? If you had never watched wrestling before and you're like, oh, I'm interested in watching wrestling, let's find out about Vince McMahon, and then watch this documentary, why would you ever watch wrestling? I don't know the answer to that.
Yep.
And
also touching upon the Sable stuff as well, they also delved into the Trish Stratus deal as well. That whole the barking like a dog segment.
Yep.
Which every time I watch that, it just ages worse and worse. I had seen that segment in years.
Oh, it's squeamish.
It's very uncomfortable. And I thought, though, the two journalists there, Meltzer and the female journalist there, whose name all of a sudden escapes me, but I thought they did a good job of breaking it down, of, like, the audience that they attracted at that time when it came to that storyline, how it's supposed to be a story of the heel boss, like, yelling at this woman, right? And he's the heel and she's supposed to be the babyface. But the way that they presented the product at the time, the crowd was cheering on Vince throughout that whole ordeal. And it's still like, it still makes me uncomfortable, especially now with all the stuff that's come out. Like, I just, watching that whole thing again, it's like what you were mentioning. Like, if you wanted to tell somebody why you watch wrestling, you absolutely would not show this. And if somebody that was new and didn't know anything about wrestling was watching this, they would also be looking at this and thinking, man, why would somebody want to watch this product if this is what's kind of being shown on screen? So yeah, that segment, when they brought that back, I was, I was uncomfortable again. And everything that kind of went on with Sable, and those were really like, it was uncomfortable, but it was necessary parts of the story in terms of trying to tell the Vince McMahon person and character and what they're trying to get across with him in this documentary. So I thought those were the strongest points in a way. And then a lot of the other parts of the episode were stuff that I could do without. I didn't need talk about the XFL. I didn't really need talk about.
Oh no, hold on. I'm gonna cut you off. And at least the best part of this one, by far, one of the best things that is happened in this whole documentary. Bob Costas dropped an F-bomb.
That's true.
Come on.
That totally
like,
caught me
God.
off guard. That's true.
Bob Costas just dropped an F-bomb. It was incredible.
I never heard him swear before. Never heard him say the F word before. That blew me away. That's true. That is true.
So I literally sat up. I'm like, oh my God. And I haven't gone back and watched it yet, but I want to. I didn't realize it was that contentious between Costas and McMahon in that segment where they kind of got nose to nose, and it told me everything about Vince.
Yep.
Like, hey, we're going to go off script here and ask you a couple of tough questions. He didn't like tough questions. He didn't have answers. And his answer to the tough questions is, I want to rip your head off.
Yeah.
Because I don't really have an answer, because you're asking fair questions and I'm a scumbag and I don't really have answers to your questions. So my answer then is, I'm going to rip your head off.
Yeah. And I'm Vince McMahon right now, and I don't have control of the situation.
Yep.
That's the big thing too. Like, he's always been in a controlled environment, making his own universe, having his own people around him. Everything is controlled around him. But as soon as you mentioned it, Bob Costas, went on a different direction to talk about the really bad ratings for the XFL. As soon as Vince McMahon sensed he didn't have that control, you just saw it. He just lost his cool. And this is not the first time when it comes to Vince where he's lost his cool in an interview. And so, yeah, that stuff with Costas was interesting in terms of the actual analysis of the XFL, the way that they presented it. I thought if you're going to do it, you had to angle it to where it's like, this guy has tried to expand out to different parts of business that's not just wrestling for so long, whether it be the Bodybuilding Federation, the XFL, ICO Pro, the restaurant in New York Times.
Times Square.
Times Square, I should say. My bad. All of these different business ventures that Vince has taken part in, and the only thing that he's really ever been successful at has been pro wrestling. And so if they wanted to look at it from the angle of, he's tried to get out of wrestling and go into these different ventures, but he has not been able to go into these different ventures and be successful, that'd be one thing. But the way that they presented was like, the XFL, that was crazy, wasn't it? They had, Tommy Maddox played in the XFL. Did you know that? Like, stuff like that. It's like, if it was a waste for me. They also mentioned the name change of the World Wrestling Federation because the WWF came in and said the original WWF, World Wildlife Fund, said, hey, you're using our trademark, and they talk about all of that. But really, at this point of the documentary, they're talking about getting out of, the Monday Night Wars and into Ruthless Aggression. And for all the wrestling fans that are listening into this is all sort of stories that you've heard and before. That's really not going to, change your mind on stuff. Really the big things to kind of take away from this documentary was the stuff about Shane and Vince and their relationship, and really how Vince just used his powers to book himself into storylines where, as you mentioned, he would just, get in relationships and storylines with all the women on the roster and do these affair storylines in front of his wife and his kids that, looking through a modern eyes, is just it has not aged gracefully. Let's just say that.
And then I was going to say, like, the finish here, or the biggest story of this, is the one where Stephanie didn't want to say what the angle that she refused to do, and then Vince is like, "Oh, I think it was me impregnating her."
Right? Yeah, that one too.
Like, what? Best for business? Let me ask you a question here, and this is a little bit off of Vince McMahon. I don't know, because look, Trish Stratus, I think, is she's sort of a Canadian icon. She's I think she's handled herself very, very well. And I don't know Trish Stratus. I haven't heard people say bad things about Trish Stratus. I guess my question is, in watching this, so I'm just trying to piece this together, that somebody thought it was okay, that Trish Stratus thought it was okay to go out, make out with Vince McMahon because Linda McMahon apparently said it was cool, on TV in front of everybody, and then get in the ring and be told to get down on all fours and bark like a dog, like Vince McMahon, the owner, the man, is the powerful and can do anything and make the woman do whatever he wants. That's okay, because it's going to pay off at WrestleMania when I slap him. But then when she's asked to kiss a girl, and I'm not saying, like, she can do whatever she wants, and if she's not comfortable with it, that's totally fine, and that's up to her. Everyone needs to do what they're comfortable with. I guess I'm just having a hard time understanding that Trish Stratus was comfortable in making out with Vince McMahon in front of his wife, and comfortable with getting down on all fours and barking like a dog, but then wasn't comfortable in kissing another girl and lost her title the next week.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I do wonder if that it's because Trish was so new to the industry when she joined the WWF at that time. Like, she was only a year or two in the industry at that time, where, we hear a lot of times where sometimes, the term of working yourself into a shoot.
Yeah.
For me, and this is just me speculating, I have no idea. I'm in the same ballpark as you, Lee. I don't know Trish Stratus. I've heard lovely things about Trish. I've heard she's great. But at that time, especially when the boss is telling you to do something and you're so new into the industry, you're only a year or two in, and you're thinking, hey, maybe this is a big break, that maybe she's thinking, oh, like, at the end of this all, there's going to be this big payoff and storyline, so it'll all work out at the end, and kind of worked herself into a shoot at that point, trying to ignore sort of the negatives. And then that point that you mentioned when it talks about the Mickie James storyline, where she's much more established as a vet. She's one of the top women in the division. She has more say in what she wants in terms of her storylines. She can have that control to say, hey, I don't want to do this part of the storyline. And then, as you mentioned, they talk about how the next week she loses the title. I think that's where I kind of look at it. Obviously, I could be wrong, but that's how I kind of took it away, because I was a little confused about that at first. But, sometimes, and one of the things, too, with this documentary that I thought was interesting, not a lot of women on the documentary.
Nope.
Not a lot. You had Trish. You had the female journalist, by the way, Sharon Mazer. You had Linda. You had Stephanie.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure I'm missing somebody else. Wendy Richter. And that was really it. That's off the top of my head in terms of, you had Bonnie Hammer. And that's kind of an indictment too, that it's like, I'm trying to think of all the women that are in this documentary. It's like, it's like 6.
Yeah.
And you think of all the male talents that are on there. That's
Yeah,
also not
and
a good thing for Vince as well.
And especially like great to have the female talent, but how many females are on there that had disagreements or didn't like him, or like it's all his wife and his daughter and people that aren't going to make any ripples.
Yep.
Aren't going to make any waves. So let me end with this. And this is sort of a question beyond the documentary. After watching this episode number 5, and seeing the real division, at least on screen, and again, it's hard to tell exactly, but it seemed, and we both agreed, that it seems like there is a division between Shane and Vince McMahon. Does that lend more credence to Shane McMahon going to AEW and forging out maybe not his own path, but a path with somebody else, somebody different?
I think it's possible. When I came out of this, and the timing of this documentary, a little bit after, there was the photo that the Young Bucks had with Shane McMahon at the airport. So it's possible. And I think
I'm not asking you though if it's possible, because look, anything's possible. It's
right.
Wrestling.
That's true.
So like anything's possible. For me, it gave the rumors more credence. I believed the fact more that Shane McMahon could go to AEW after watching this, because of what I considered the real division within the family, not just like, oh, okay, I'm not super cool with what Dad's doing, I need to go try something else. Like, there seems to be a real division. And I thought at the end of it that he's got more of a chance to go to AEW because of what I saw on the documentary. Did you feel that way or no?
Yes, I did feel that way. It strengthened it for me for sure.
Okay.
It definitely strengthened it for me. Because now I think you got more people that are sympathetic to Shane that are watching this and saying that, wherever he goes, whatever he decides to do, whether it is in the wrestling industry or he goes back out and tries to do his own thing business wise, I think there's going to be growing support for him.
I agree.
And so, and there's going to be this encouraging of, he's going to go out there and prove he could do it on his own. And Shane has always been, of the McMahons, the sense I've always gathered, that Shane is the most liked McMahon out of all of them over the last couple of years. So I think that only adds more credence to that more people would want to support Shane and wherever he goes, whether that be AEW or otherwise. So yeah, it definitely strengthened it for me.
Okay. And so I thought so too. And I kind of thought of the rest of the family. Linda McMahon, certainly Stephanie, and, Triple H, that they've all just sunk themselves completely into the business and will do whatever it takes. Linda McMahon will go out and watch her husband do this, and Stephanie will get left at the altar and then get crucified, and then all the things that she was willing to do for the business. And not to say that Shane didn't, but he left. He didn't marry into the business. He seems to be his own guy, and his own guy that didn't get the love from his father and his family that maybe he needed at some point. And so I do think that strengthens his case to go elsewhere. And because exactly what you just said, I felt more sympathetic to Shane after watching this episode. And I think it'll be interesting to see where the future goes. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking forward to the last episode. I'm hoping that a lot of things get answered. So we will look forward to that. And that'll be our final broadcast. Zach, always good to talk to you. And anything else you wanted to get in about this one?
No, I thought the family dynamic stuff was interesting. Otherwise, there's been a lot of, kind of glossing over things and not really going deeper into stuff like I wish they would. Like they mentioned the Playboy interview, which has kind of been the basis of how people have known about Vince's childhood and his upbringing. And they also, they touched about the Sable stuff and all that, but it went back to being where I didn't know what this documentary wanted to be, whether it be a look into Vince McMahon or a history of WWE documentary. It really felt like it was kind of counter. It didn't really know what it wanted to be. And so that was sort of my takeaway from episode 5. So we'll see with episode 6, the final episode. Can't believe we've been able to get to this point and all the audio we've recorded, and we're only one episode away from finishing this puppy up. So should be a fun one.
Episode number 6, the finale, coming up next week. This has been the review of Family Business, episode 5. Lee Versage, Zach McGibbon for This Is Wrestling.